Yes, sir. Welcome, everyone, to tonight's Socialist Action webinar. Our subject tonight is exposing the U.S. imperialist war machine, Syria, Iran, Venezuela, and Yemen. I could name some 80 other countries where the United States has military bases, but our focus will be there. Our guests today are Joe Lombardo, who is the national coordinator of UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition, the most prominent anti-war organization and coalition in the United States, aimed at organizing mass opposition to the US wars at home and abroad. We also have with us Judith Bello. She, like Joe, is on the administrative committee of the United National Anti-War Coalition, and she is a leader founder of the Syria Solidarity Committee. Judy has visited Syria, and we want to hear from her tonight on her experiences. Joe did a not too long ago trip to Venezuela, where the United States was organizing a coup. So let's begin with a couple of questions. Joe and Judy, it's clear that the US wars don't appear in the major press these days, at least much. Even though we have some 1,100 military bases, or some say 800, in 70 countries, the corporate media doesn't seem to cover the fact that the mechanisms of death and destruction continue around the world. Joe, give us your take on the state of the US war machine that seems to be off the headlines because of the impending elections in the United States, the COVID crisis, the financial crisis, the global warming crisis, and a series of other crises, not to mention the one that's least talked about, the slaughter machine organized by US imperialism that occupies much of the globe with force and violence. Joe, the floor is yours.
Well, I think one of the reasons that the anti-war movement gets no press in the United States, even before the COVID crisis and even before the elections, is the fact that both parties, both major parties, Democrats and Republicans, both support the war. In fact, if you look at their policies, you probably could say the Democrats are even to the right of the Republicans on many issues. So within the two major parties, there is no real anti-war wing that exists. And it's totally a grassroots movement. And the corporate media, which is controlled by one of the parties or the other, is not going to talk about these issues. So it's a little bit more difficult. It's an uphill battle to organize the anti-war movement during this period, even though polls show that the majority of people, the vast majority of people, are against war. And that's pretty much what we're up against. And I think that's why you're not going to hear much about it in the corporate media.
Thanks, Joe. Judy, I was looking at a recent list, 50-year list of the some 70 countries that the United States has invaded. Of course, in every case, they claim it was to preserve democracy in those countries. They invaded Venezuela in 1954, and the result was 400,000 indigenous people were killed by the US-backed dictatorship, 80,000 by the Somoza dictatorship, tens of thousands by the Cuban dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. When I look at every single one of these US wars and interventions, the cost was in millions of lives, 4 million in Vietnam. Today, of course, as with the Iraq war, the US corporate media machine is in the process of justifying these wars, either on the grounds of national security, which in the Middle East means oil, or on the grounds of humanitarian aid against a dictator. In Syria, for example, 500,000 people have died because of the US-backed regime change war that includes the most heinous forces that the United States is allied with to bring down the Assad regime. What's your take on the situation in Syria today? Has things stabilized because we don't see anything in the media? Is the United States still planning to occupy, in the words of President Trump, we got the oil? What's your take?
My take is that the war against Syria continues in various forms, and that the U.S. has in fact spread that war to Lebanon, where they're putting so much financial pressure on Lebanon, even before the explosion, that it was wreaking havoc on Lebanese people's lives, and that the numbers that you've quoted so far, by and large, do not include the number of people who died of starvation, the number of people who died from being dislocated and immiserated in their lives, the number of people who committed suicide because they no longer had a place in society. So I think that all those numbers are way understated, and that the United States doesn't care at all about the people. But unfortunately, because, as you say, most Americans oppose war and want to help people and want to be good people, they frame everything they do as if it were going to help people. But of course, it isn't helping people, it's hurting them. So it's very hard for the ordinary American to have a clue really of what's going on overseas, because even when they do hear about it in the mainstream news, they hear a story about US benevolence. And I might add that the Middle East and Syria and Yemen and Iraq and Iran and places like that is horrible. And in South America and the places that you mentioned, but also all over Africa. AFRICOM's got like a dozen new bases, large bases in the last couple of years. So the United States is essentially about empire and hegemony, and the United States government serves serves the corporate interests and the interests of the bankers. And even a century ago, pretty much, it seems like that's what General Butler said, that he was what did he say? He was a henchman for corporations, I think. And even though he was a highly decorated military general. So the United States didn't just start doing this. They've been doing it all our lives. I think the worst thing for a person like me to find out when I was an adult already, that throughout my entire childhood, all through the 50s, the United States was wreaking havoc, not only in South America and the Middle East, but also in Europe, in Greece, and in Italy, and some other countries in Europe. So the United States is a belligerent force around the world, and the other governments tread carefully because they don't want to get hurt. But it's a very complicated situation with and it relies on having people who are bought off to follow along and do what they're supposed to do. And because the real bosses are the corporations, these people may not appear to be American puppets, but they are puppets of the same puppet master. So this is really a terrible situation. And in Syria, what's happening right now is the United States is using sanctions to crush any hope of a recovery for the people there. They have reduced, and not only did they in Syria, but in Lebanon, they've reduced the currency to being virtually worthless on the international markets. They have closed all access to trade to the best of their ability. And the only thing that keeps Syria going really is that they have supporters in Russia and China and in the the countries that the United States will tell you are bad guys, or from Iran. Iran and Syria have an alliance going back to the Iran-Iraq War. It's not based on religion. People will always tell you it's religion in the Middle East, but Iran and Syria started this alliance because they were both under attack and they're both anti-imperialist countries. that strongly believe in their independence and sovereignty. And they formed the beginnings at that time of a regional alliance or that would stand up to the hegemons. So that is one of the reasons why Iran comes under so much threat, is because, and they say, well, Iran is a hegemon. No, Iran is the anti-hegemon. And they are a member of a community. They see themselves as a member of a community of other countries, whereas the United States does not see itself as a member of any community. It sees itself as a governing force. It's an outlaw.
Thanks, Judy. You've covered the ground, the whole world. But you know, at one point, while you were talking about Iran and Iraq, I thought you really were talking about Venezuela, because everything you said about those countries applies to Venezuela. Joe, you visited Venezuela recently and met with the president of that country as part of an anti-war delegation. Tell us about this US war in Iran and Iraq, I mean Venezuela, where they used sanctions, where they sponsored an invasion army, and they went so far, they meaning the government of the United States, to appoint their own president. It reminds me of the appointment in 1953 of the dictator Shah Reza Pahlavi after the CIA organized a coup that overthrew that government, the elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh, and then the United States proceeded to steal all the oil. Joe, tell us more about your trip to Venezuela, and also what is the position of the United National Anti-War Coalition on US wars against working people at home and abroad?
Well, the major thing, I believe, that I saw in Venezuela when we were there was that the narrative we were hearing in the United States was not just an exaggeration, but was 180 degrees in the opposite of what we were noticing on the streets. When we were there, we got there just as there had been a crash of their electrical system. When we met with Maduro, he said their technicians have actually traced this to interference with their system that took place from both Chicago and Houston, Texas. He didn't get into the details of how they saw that, but their whole electrical system was made by the United States and German companies. And because of the sanctions, they can't even get spare parts. So they have to jerry-rig a lot of what's going on. But they claim that, the United States claim that the electoral system went down because they just can't control their own government and they're inefficient and in bad shape and so forth. And they also claimed that there was rioting in the streets once this electrical system went down. And that was what was so interesting, because it prompted our entire delegation to do a video and talk about what we were seeing in the streets of Caracas, because there was no rioting. In fact, exactly the opposite was happening. What happened was people got together in the communities and the various streets when the electricity went off. And in Caracas, they have a lot of high-rise buildings because the government has been on a massive building project to give housing for all people that don't have houses or are underhoused. And so they have these high-rise buildings with the names like Che Guevara building and Malcolm X building, things like that. And so the problem was that the elevators didn't work in these buildings during this blackout. So the communities organized together and they got a lot of young people who were better at walking the steps to go and knock on everybody's door and make sure they were okay, especially older people, to make sure they had some kind of candles or some kind of water they needed, because the water couldn't even be pumped up to their apartments. In one street we saw as we walked around during this crisis, so-called crisis, the whole street just came out and people brought out guitars and other things and were having a party. And nowhere did we see any kind of rioting, which is very, very different than what has happened under blackouts that took place in the United States. But because of this, the major airlines decided they were not going to fly to to Caracas, and it required some of us to stay an extra week till we could get flights out of the country. Now, the other things I noticed then was that when we were traveling around, we'd go on the subways, and they also had these cable cars that went up to the hills that surround Caracas, because like other Latin American countries, a lot of people from the countryside moved to the city because of economic problems to try to get work. And these communities along the hillsides were not even recognized under the old government. But the present government has now put them on the map, has registered all people to vote, has had medical facilities there, have paved the roads, and so forth. But when you got on the subway in Caracas, the interesting thing was you don't pay. You just walk onto the subway. At the time, if you had a car and you went to a gas station, you could drive into the gas station, and because they had so much oil in that country, the gas was for free. You didn't pay at the gas station. You just went up and pumped your gas. But now with the sanctions that are happening, they've upped the sanctions, especially during this COVID crisis. And what they have done is they are sanctioning any oil tankers from whatever country that will carry oil to sanctioned countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and other countries. And so a lot of these tankers don't want to be sanctioned because it means they can't go into US ports or British ports or other ports by the US people. So even in a country like Venezuela that has so much oil, they are not able to get oil now because they've always had to mix their oils, a very heavy crude oil with a lighter crude, and their main companies for to process the oil were actually refining companies were actually in the United States, and the United States doesn't let them do that anymore, and actually stole their entire gas company, which was Citgo in the United States, and stole massive amounts of money that were in US banks and other banks from them, making it very difficult for them to function at all. So they're having a hard time getting gas right now. So during this crisis, when the US has upped the sanctions, not allowing medical gear, not allowing medicine, not allowing the respirators to get into their country, they are having some problems. And they can't even, when they get seed from other countries, for instance, they can't even drive it to the center of the country, which is where most of their growing goes, because they don't have enough gas to do that. And it's also really hurting Cuba because of these sanctions. Sanctions, the UNAC considers just another form of war. And in 1 year, at the time we were there, we heard from sanctions about 40,000 people had died. People couldn't get cancer treatments. People couldn't get other treatments. I have type 2 diabetes, so when I went down there, I had some metformin with me, which I take. And when I left, they asked if I could leave it there because they just don't have the drugs. They're not allowed to get the drugs. So during this pandemic time, when countries like Cuba and China have been trying to express some international solidarity, the US has been doing the opposite. But
let me interrupt for a second.
Sure.
To say that Venezuela and Iran, countries we're talking about today, rank 1 and 2 in the world with regard to the known oil resources. Here you have, as you say, Venezuela with the largest oil resources in the world, can't sell oil on the world market. And as you mentioned, its oil company, Citgo, which at one point literally offered to the poor communities in New York City a qualitatively reduced oil price in order to help alleviate poverty in New York. And yet the United States government, in the name of being allowed to appoint the president of the country, emptied international banking institutions of $1.5 billion of Venezuela's money. And they try to blockade it. And recently, the Venezuelans caught red-handed CIA agents who were preparing to bomb oil refineries, embargo, as you say, medicines. And yet we blame all this on the dictator of the United States, where in truth, Venezuela used to be Rockefeller's private island. I'm talking about the president of the United States at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, appointing the son of the richest man in the world, John D. Rockefeller Nelson, to be the overseer of CIA and US policy in Latin America, where they installed one dictator after another, virtually every country. And now we have Iran, the second largest oil producer in the world, oil resource in the world, similarly blockaded and sanctions along with 37 countries. So here you have the anomaly of the American media blaring that these countries are headed by dictators, that they're starving, that their own ineptitude is what leads to the decline in their health system, the the devaluation of their own currency. And yet the imperialist beast, whose president publicly proclaims, well, we're getting out of Syria, which he never did, but we got the oil. Can you imagine? We got the oil, which is exactly what happened when the United States invaded and continues to invade and occupy Iran. And when the Iranian government protested the American government's drone murder of a guest of their country, Suleiman, who headed up the Iran Quds Force, which was there to defend which was there to defend the Iraqi government at government approval, the government demanded the United States leave. But the bully imperialist, of course, refused and said, if you try to kick us out of your own country, we'll impose even more sanctions.
So might I add to that? Oops, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Judy, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to say that this again is, for one thing, Iran in their anti-imperialist stance, and they have stubbornly stuck to this since their revolution. They have been sending oil tankers to Venezuela, and there have been a number of instances of piracy on the high seas by the United States and the UK, trying to block those, well, and succeeding in taking those ships. So at the same time, though, Iran has persevered and managed to get some oil to Venezuela. At the same time, back in the Middle East, one of the reasons why things are so stuck in Syria is that Trump's original plan was to back our people off across the border into Iraq so that he could say he got them out of Syria and not really change anything. But because of the incident in Iraq, it turned out that the Iraqis were so angry that they couldn't back any more forces into Iraq, and they were having trouble keeping them there. So instead, they moved more people into Syria. But in the end, the biggest problem, at least in the Middle East, are the mercenary armies that the United States provisions, who are so destructive to the countries, to the people. During the height of the violence of the Syrian war, they were going in and murdering the entire populations of small villages and beheading the town priest in the Christian village and in front of the other people. They were just wreaking havoc. but even now, there's been a siege of fires, which most of you probably haven't heard about, of forest fires in Syria, where they cannot afford, they've lost thousands and thousands of olive trees. And before that, there were fires that spread across their grain growing areas to the east. And it turns out that through investigation, these fires were arson. And that although it is hot and dry, that at this time of year, the fires are arson because it's just not the time of year when that would happen. And so they have a major investigation going on there to find out who set the fires. So it's not enough to have the sanctions. You have to do more damage. And it's like the electrical system in Venezuela. Here in Syria, they've got manufacturing on its knees. Back in like 2012 and 13, the mercenaries literally dismantled the factories in Aleppo and carried the machinery across the border into Turkey and set up manufacturing areas in Turkey for the Turkish proxy fighters. They are using every possible tactic to undermine civilization in these countries.
I appreciate it. Let me get to a political question for both of you, starting with Joe, about the United National Anti-War Coalition. We have a simple position, and I'm on the administrative committee along with Joe and Judy, of self-determination of oppressed nations. U.S. hands off and out now. We reject all of the rationalizations for the United States intervening, bombing, sanctioning, embargoing, blockading these countries. So UNAC simply says self-determination for poor and oppressed nations. But we don't take a position in support of the governments of any nation that the United States is invading, other than to say we support that government's right and the people's right to self-determination, to determine their own future. It's not the United States' right to determine the policies, the governments, or any other condition in poor and oppressed nations. We simply say out now. Joe, explain that in a bit more detail. UNAC has some 150 organizations affiliated with it in one way or another. They're quite diverse, as I understand, but they come together on the principle of self-determination. Why do you think that's important for the anti-war movement?
Well, I think that's the best way to build a broad coalition. There's a lot of misinformation in the media in the United States about the nature of various governments that we oppose. When we oppose it, the first thing that happens is misinformation is sent out there, and we hear a lot of stuff about how this government is terrible to its people and so forth. So people might not have a full understanding of what these governments are. And even if they do, even someone like Saddam Hussein, who is not an angel by any means, the United States has no right to attack that country. And if we just base it on the right of self-determination of any country to determine its own policies and politics without the interference of the United States or any of its allies or any of the mercenaries that they're going to send into these countries, we can build the broadest coalition. Now, the anti-war movement is not in a kind of state it was during the Vietnam War or even during 2003 when we brought millions of people out into the streets. But that's an important idea, because when we do build, when we are able to better involve people in the anti-war movement, and I think we're coming to that point because there's such upsurge right now in the United States and through this COVID period. I think the kind of political consciousness of the entire population of the United States has been raised to some extent. And then we can best build this kind of coalition. So we don't make that a criteria for joining UNAC. You just support the right of self-determination and say the US hands off and bring the troops home now. And that's the best way, in our opinion, to oppose imperialism.
And Judy, your take on the same issue?
I agree with Joe. It is the best way to build a coalition. And it's also really the most just stance, I think, because it's not passionate, support of some other government than our own. And maybe we don't have enough information, or even if we do, some places that we support for their sovereignty have governments, as Joe said, that are not the most wonderful government in the world. However, if you compare Iraq under Saddam Hussein to the current mess that Iraq is, certainly they were better off under Saddam Hussein, not because he was the most wonderful government in the world, but because they had a working government and a working government structure, and countries need that. And if you say in the United States, right now there's a lot of talk about the election, and people who love Donald Trump like him a lot, and a lot of other people just despise him and want him out, and they're fearful of what he might do. But in reality, would we like some other country, the Chinese or the Australians or somebody somewhere, somebody from another planet to come and start a war in our country in an effort to depose him? I mean, that would be a disaster. That is not what we would want. We wouldn't want a foreign intervention to come and use a sledgehammer to solve what is our internal crisis, and which is governed basically by our issues and our culture. And in these other countries, that's true as well. Even when things are unstable or they're challenged, if we are not adding to the fire by financial means and war making and other ways of unbalancing the country, then they can solve their own political problems. But when we intervene, or when I say we, I hate to say we, when the United States intervenes in these countries to have what they want, they do not have a track record of installing good governments, for one thing. So even if the government they replaced wasn't wonderful, they have a good chance of replacing it with a worse one, because that's their track record. And you can easily read the history to find that out. And you can see that we support, the Saudis, the Assad family in Saudi Arabia, which prior to the arrival of the British in the United States and the Americans was just Arabia. And it was not the sole possession of the Assad family. And you can see throughout all the list of names in Latin America that you, Jeff, just named and that Joe named, there all these horrific governments that the United States put in power. So why would we think that a US intervention would be helpful to the people of a country? There's really no evidence that that has in the past been the case. So we really need to just say hands off and let them solve their own problems, because that's, as I say, it's the most fair solution for everyone. And if the United States were to turn the resources that are used to destroy these other countries into resources used to build this country, we would be wealthy beyond imagination. But because they seem to be doing this to get wealth, but the wealth is not coming to the American people. The wealth is being drained from the American people, and it's going to a few rich people.
Judy, let me take it another step. Here we are on the eve of the second and final presidential election debate. The first one, by agreement between both candidates, the US war policy was excluded from the debate. And that is for good reason. When the Trump administration proposed a $750 billion war budget. The Democrats objected and upped it another 40 to 50 billion, counting money for secret wars in the CIA. The United States spends over $1 trillion a year and more, with virtual bipartisan agreement. What's UNAC's position on the war budget? On the one hand, we'll start with Joe. And second, does UNAC take a position on candidates in the presidential election? And third, what are the prospects, in your opinion, regardless of who becomes president, of building a powerful US anti-war movement that fights against all wars against working people at home and abroad? Let's start with you, Joe.
Well, first of all, I think you got to start with why the US intervenes in other countries and why we use the name imperialism. I think really the US does it for its own selfish reasons, although they try to say that they're doing it to bring better governments and so forth, to justify it to the American people so they will support it. But you know, they want to privatize everything in every other country so they can get some of the profits coming back to the Wall Street banks and to the corporations and banks in the United States. They get a cheap source of labor where these repressive governments can stop unions from forming, or don't have to worry about health and safety for workers or environmental protections, so they could make more money. And I think this is an essential point in this particular time in US capitalism, because it is in a crisis and it needs to do this more. So we're going to see continuing wars around the world on the part of the United States. On the elections, and that's why I think both of the two capitalist parties support war. On the elections, we don't take a position. Jeff, you're running for president, and you are on our administrative committee, but we don't take a position on your candidacy or the Green Party candidacy or Democratic, or if people are in any of those parties and want to come out and protest the wars, we want them to do that, because that's the best way to build a broad coalition. And people are at various levels of understanding and consciousness about all of these things. So that is very important. Now, you said about the elections, and what was, just quickly, if you could tell me the two other points that you had in there.
The election is over.
Okay.
Any changes in US policy on the one hand, and what about the prospects for deepening the construction of a broad-based united front mass action anti-war movement?
Well, I believe that once the elections are over, and who knows what's going to happen in the elections, who's going to get in either by vote or fraud or force, but whoever gets in on the question of war, they are both pro-imperialist. They're anti. They both want to do the coups in Venezuela. They're both anti-Cuba. They on all these issues. You know, even in Syria, the Democrats have pushed further. They said Trump has been too soft in Syria. He's been too soft on Russia. They don't agree that they should have any negotiations with North Korea or any of this stuff. So I believe that the policies on war will continue. And, you know, it's something like 64 cents of a very discretionary tax dollar that goes to war. With that situation, there is no money for anything else in the society. So when people push for universal health care or anything like this, you can't do that unless you oppose this war budget. Now, some people say we want to cut it by 10%, and some people say we want to cut it by 50% who are anti-war. I'd like to cut the entire thing. You know, before World War II, when the United States went to war, at the end of the war, it demobilized its military. It said, okay, the war's over, go home. And, we can recruit people at other point. We don't need a standing army. But after World War II, there actually was a big movement within the GIs themselves. It was called the Going Home movement, where they thought they were going to be demobilized, but they weren't. And we kept a string of bases in countries all around the world. Your figure, Jeff, I think that you gave was wrong. I think it's about what the New York Times said at one point. We have troops in 172 countries. We have 20 times the number of military bases as all other countries in the world combined. And the country with the second highest is Britain, who's our ally, and the country with the third highest is France, which is our ally. And these are based upon their own imperial past, the remnants of what they've kept in terms of military bases and military in countries that used to be their own colonies. So I think we will continue to need to fight against the wars. And I do believe we're going to be in a good position to do it after the elections, because there is no solution. I think a lot of people who will vote for Biden will do it because they just don't want Trump, not because they like anything about his policy. If anybody knows what his policy is, as far as I can see, his one political platform is I'm better than that other guy. And so none of the problems that we have in our society are going to be addressed, from the cop killings to the wars to medical care or any of this stuff. And plus, we're coming out of this pandemic when people's rents are going to be coming due, and there's no way, people don't have jobs. And so there's going to be an upsurge. And in the context of that upsurge, we have an important role to play to connect it to what's going on around the world, to the military budget, and to show how these people around the world are also opposing our government's policies, and they need to be our allies. So I believe we're going to be in a good position to build the anti-war movement. And I think we need to keep it in the streets after the elections and before the elections, and continue to build our movement.
Okay, Judy, I'm going to ask you to wrap it up in another 2, 3, 4 minutes. And then I'm going to ask you both a surprise question. So I'll keep the surprise until Judy finishes, and then we'll conclude with a couple of minutes in my surprise question. Go ahead, Judy.
Okay, well, I agree with Joe that we want the movement to be as broad as possible. We don't want to exclude anyone. And I think that we have to stop thinking on axes like Democrat, Republican, left, right, and whatever, that we really need to have a new frame of reference to pull this country out of, because there are just too many misperceptions, even about what left is. Like, we consider ourselves left, and we are, but there are other people who consider themselves left who disagree with us on many, many things, especially with regard to the wars, because they've bought all the US talk about humanitarian aid and so on, and some other divisive issues. So I think what we need to do is just start looking for a real grassroots movement of people who oppose the wars, who don't want to be hurting people elsewhere, who don't want us to be hurting them, and who don't want, and who do want to bring our resources home and make the lives for the people in this country better. And the sanctions are real obvious, as well as the money spent on the wars. The sanctions are a real obvious thing to look at, because we have a form of sanctions on the poor people in our own country, because below a certain level of income, you do not have the resources to step up. You don't have a car to go do things. You don't have a good computer to work with. You don't have the materials to move to the next step. If every day you're trying just to feed your child, or you're sick all the time because you have no way to get medical assistance, or if you're struggling or homeless or living in a in housing that's not enough for your family, then you are not able to participate in society wholly. And that's exactly the thing they're doing to the people in other countries. They're making it impossible for them to participate in global society.
Judy,
So we
have
need
get on
to
to our
work with
final
that.
question.
Sorry.
And this is our surprise question because we are going to turn our attention to this debate. We have another webinar following it to give socialist actions analysis. But the one question that everybody is talking about is whether or not President Trump is going to follow through on his threat to declare himself the president of the United States on election day, regardless of the results. In addition to that, he's going to declare himself the president and not count some 40, 50, if not 60 million votes. And if people protest, he says, in the streets, this abrogation of the constitutional right to vote, he has threatened to call in federal troops to put down these protests. My view is that without in any way indicating support to Biden, Democrats, Republicans, the American people, all people, immigrants and everyone, have an obligation to get out into the streets and say no to what amounts to a coup, an imposed dictatorship by the president of the United States, which would send shockwaves around the world. Joe and Judy, let me ask you that final question and see if you can restrain yourself from talking about a possible American coup d'etat for 2 minutes each. Let's start with Judy, and Joe, you have the last word.
Okay, I'm not sure I entirely believe Trump has it in his power to do that, and or that I think he's a blowhard, and it's his nature to make big threats. However, should there be such a thing happening, one thing I think is clear, that there's going to be a period of up to a few weeks after the election when the result is indeterminate. And that is a very bad thing, because that's his time to say, well, okay, it's indeterminate, therefore I'm president. But I would hope that, yes, we need to go to the streets, and we need to say, and to demand that every single vote be counted, and that that no one be allowed, that Trump not be allowed to take a stance before there's a stance to take. And so I think, as I say, that I'm not as concerned as some people, because I do feel that it's not really in his power to pull that off. On the other hand, I do think that the people do need to come to the streets and stand up for ourselves and do whatever's necessary. If it means, having, a general strike. I've heard people actually in this country, which is very new, talk about a general strike. People who live in upstate New York.
Thank
So
you. I got to cut you
hope
off.
that is possible.
Joe, you have the last word on this question.
Yeah, well, whether or not Trump has the ability to do something like that, cause a coup, he's talked about it. And that is an incredible threat that we've never heard from an American president, saying that the elections are invalid. Elections are something that has been won in the United States by fighting. In the original Constitution, it was only white men that had a property, and then women got the right to vote, blacks got the right to vote, all people got the right to vote. It took a struggle, and for him to discount that, and it goes in, it's related to all the other attacks on civil liberties that we've seen recently. So we have to be out in the streets. Now, where Judy lives in Rochester, New York, the Labor Council passed a resolution saying that if such a thing happens, the labor movement needs to call a general strike. Right. We took in Albany, where I am, I'm a member of the Troy Area Labor Council. We brought that same resolution, not everybody knows this, but at the Wednesday meeting, brought that same resolution to our meeting, and we also passed it. So I think there is general sentiment in this country that if he does that, we need to do something further than we've ever seen before, and it can be an explosive situation. And the anti-war movement and every other movement for social change under those circumstances has to come together, and we have to make that as explosive as possible. And I think what will come out of that, if such a thing happens, will go far beyond the election of Biden. People start talking about all the different things that they need and start understanding their power, and it's a way to get it. So we, as political people, need to understand that. And if Trump tries something like that, we need to be calling people out in the streets in a massive way.
Joe and Judy, I'm honored to have you with us tonight. Joe is the national coordinator of the United National Anti-War Coalition and a member of its administrative committee, as is Judy. And Judy is a longtime Syria solidarity activist. We're honored to have you. I'm Jeff Mackler. I'm Socialist Action's National Secretary and its 2020 candidate for the presidency of the United States. And I have to say that if I am elected president of the United States, on election day or thereafter, I will immediately move to abolish the US war budget and bring the troops home from every nation on earth, allowing the poor people of the world to determine their own future and the American people to construct a fundamentally different society. Thanks for being with us. We'll call it a night. Joe and Judy, we're honored again to have you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.